The call came in at exactly 11:42 p.m. A single ring shattered the heavy silence of the fire station, followed by the sharp voice of the dispatcher cutting through the intercom. Forest fire reported. Coordinates incoming. Wind conditions unstable. High flame activity observed. The firefighters had trained for this, had rehearsed for nights just like this, but there was always a moment of eerie stillness before the chaos began. Then motion, controlled, precise, and urgent. Gloved hands snatched up radios and helmets. Heavy boots pounded against the polished floor as men and women bolted toward the gleaming red fire engines, their bodies moving on instinct. Within moments, the station transformed from a place of rest to a machine in motion, every cog turning with ruthless efficiency. Engines roared to life. The massive vehicles surged forward, lights flashing, sirens splitting the darkness. The city lights faded behind them as they sped toward the unknown, swallowed by the deep, looming blackness of the forested outskirts. The dispatcher's voice crackled through their radios again. Flames visible from multiple vantage points. Reports indicate rapid spread. Possible wildlife presence near ignition site. The team exchanged glances. A fire of this scale in heavily wooded terrain was a nightmare scenario. Trees packed tightly together, thick undergrowth, unpredictable wind shifts. Everything worked against them. Inside the truck, Captain Ross studied the coordinates flashing on the screen. His brow furrowed as he assessed the topography. They were heading deep into the forest, far beyond the reach of immediate backup. They would be on their own for a while. The air grew heavier as they neared the location. Even with the truck's powerful ventilation system, the acrid scent of smoke began to creep in, burning at the back of their throats. They rounded the last bend, and then a glow on the horizon. It started as a dull orange smudge against the ink-black sky, no bigger than a streetlight in the distance. But as they sped forward, the smudge grew, expanded, flickering wildly against the dark canopy above. Then, suddenly, the road dipped, opening into a valley, and the full scale of the fire came into view. Gasps filled the cabin. Even seasoned firefighters, men and women who had battled infernos in warehouses, apartment complexes, and open fields, felt their stomachs tighten at the sight before them. The forest was ablaze. Towering flames engulfed the trees, stretching upward like grasping fingers, their fiery tips clawing at the heavens. Smoke billowed in thick, roiling waves, swallowing entire sections of the forest, making it impossible to see where the fire ended and the sky began. Sparks shot through the air like fireflies on a warpath, carried by the relentless wind, each ember a tiny harbinger of destruction. And then they saw it. A single, massive pine tree, nearly fully consumed by flames, its trunk glowing red-hot as the fire devoured its bark. But it wasn't the tree itself that made the firefighters freeze. It was the silhouette beside it. A bear, or rather, a bear's shadow, standing stark against the raging backdrop of fire. Its outline was unmistakable, solid and unmoving, a dark form in contrast to the violent brightness surrounding it. The firefighters could see the curve of its back, the thick muscles beneath its fur, the powerful limbs rooted in place. For a moment, it was impossible to tell if the bear was real or if the fire had merely cast its shape against the smoke like a cruel mirage. The flames roared louder, an angry, living thing. The tree crackled, splitting apart at its base. The bear remained still. The firefighters braced themselves. The fire raged on, and the night was far from over. The fire raged like a living beast, its glowing tendrils consuming everything in sight, reaching hungrily for more. Trees cracked and splintered under the relentless assault of the heat, their skeletal forms collapsing into smoldering embers, sending fiery debris spiraling into the choking black sky. Smoke billowed upward in thick, rolling waves, turning the night into an oppressive, suffocating abyss. The once cool forest air now replaced with a heavy, blistering atmosphere that burned with every breath. The firefighters moved in practiced precision, their bodies conditioned to push through exhaustion, through the overwhelming heat, through the primal human instinct that told them to run when the world was falling apart around them. But even amid the chaos, something held them frozen in place, an anomaly among the destruction, something that made even the most seasoned among them pause. The bear hadn't run. It was supposed to. Every animal, no matter how strong, no matter how fierce, knew that fire was an enemy, a force that could not be fought, only fled from. The deer scattered before the flames. The birds had long since vanished into the distant sky. The smaller creatures that had no means of escape had already fallen silent, but the bear remained. It stood there, massive and unmoving, its thick coat illuminated by the flickering light of the inferno, the edges of its fur glowing as the firelight danced across it in shifting, golden hues. Its breath came in heavy, labored puffs, its broad shoulders rising and falling as it let out low, guttural sounds that seemed almost to merge with the deep roar of the fire itself. But it was not frozen in fear. It was not watching the flames in confusion, nor was it dazed, trapped, or unsure of where to go. It was doing something else entirely. It was searching. Its claws tore into the blackened earth, its powerful limbs digging with an urgency that made no sense, raking through the scorched debris, sending up clouds of ash and embers that swirled in the fiery air. It worked with desperate, relentless force, its massive paws striking against the charred remains of the forest floor, the sharp, snapping sound of splintering bark and crumbling dirt cutting through the symphony of destruction around it. It ignored the heat, ignored the looming danger of the collapsing tree above, ignored everything except whatever it was trying to reach beneath the ground. There was no hesitation in its movements, no confusion or hesitation, just a single-minded determination, a primal, unshakable need that overpowered even the instinct to flee. The firefighters stood still, their training screaming at them to move, to act, to pull back before the fire swallowed more of the forest, but none of them could take their eyes off the scene unfolding before them. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that gnawed at the edges of their understanding, something that defied all logic. "What the hell is it doing?" Martinez muttered, his voice muffled by the thick protective mask strapped across his face, his gloved hands gripping the heavy nozzle of the hose with white-knuckled tension. No one answered, because no one knew. Animals didn't act this way. They were predictable in disaster, panicked, instinct-driven, reduced to their most primal nature when faced with something as merciless as fire. This wasn't panic. This wasn't blind fear. This was something else. The bear let out another low, rumbling noise, a deep, resonant sound that sent an involuntary shiver through the team, a sound that wasn't a growl, wasn't aggression, but something more haunting, something raw. It almost sounded like a plea. Ross swallowed hard, his heartbeat hammering in his ears beneath the suffocating heat, his mind racing through every possibility, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. The bear should be running. It should be fighting to escape. But instead, it was digging as if something more important than its own survival lay beneath that tree. The flames curled around the trunk, climbing higher, devouring the bark, the glowing embers pulsing with every crack and split that echoed through the burning forest. The fire had almost completely eaten through the base. It wouldn't hold much longer. Still, the bear didn't move. It kept clawing at the dirt, as if it could reach through the earth itself, as if whatever it was searching for mattered more than the fire, more than the searing heat, more than its own life. And then, a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible against the roar of the flames. A whimper. Ross felt his breath catch in his throat, his body going rigid as realization struck him like a thunderclap. The bear wasn't confused. It wasn't lost. It wasn't searching for escape. It was searching for someone. Jesus, someone breathed, barely audible over the fire. Another sharp crack split the air. The tree was moments from collapse. The ground trembled beneath them as the fire chewed through its foundation, weakening it further with every passing second. But the bear didn't stop. Ross clenched his jaw, every muscle in his body tensed with indecision, with the suffocating weight of knowing that whatever lay beneath that tree was out of time. The bear let out another sound, this one higher-pitched, almost frantic, its huge paws striking the ground harder, faster, its breath coming in ragged bursts. And for the first time since arriving at the fire, Ross felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear, not urgency, not just the instinct to fight the fire, but something deeper, something dangerously close to understanding. The tree gave one final, agonizing groan of protest, and then it began to fall. The fire continued its relentless march, consuming the forest with a fury that seemed almost alive. The smoke curled into the sky, blotting out the stars, turning the night into a suffocating abyss of ash and embers. The roaring flames painted everything in hues of deep orange and violent red, the heat pressing in like an invisible wall, stifling and oppressive. The firefighters stood in tense silence, their bodies rigid, their breathing heavy beneath the weight of their gear, their eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before them. The bear still hadn't moved. It remained near the burning tree, its massive paws scraping at the ground, its breath coming in ragged bursts. Its thick fur shimmered in the firelight, the edges singed, smoke curling from the tips. It should have been long gone by now, should have vanished into the darkness like every other creature that had fled the inferno. But it didn't run. It didn't flinch. It didn't even acknowledge the destruction around it. It only kept digging. Mark watched, his pulse hammering against his ribs, his fingers tightening around the strap of his gear. Every instinct screamed at him to hold his position, to stay back, to let the fire take its course, to follow the rules. But something about the bear's behavior gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, something that made the usual logic of his training seem distant and hollow. He had fought fires before, countless ones, each one a war against nature itself. But he had never seen anything like this. It wasn't fear that kept the bear here. It was something deeper, something stronger. "Mark, don't even think about it." The voice came through his radio, sharp and laced with warning. It was Captain Ross. The man's tone carried the weight of authority, of years spent in the field, of knowing exactly how badly things could go wrong in situations like this. But Mark barely heard him. He was already moving. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the team as he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the charred remains of the forest floor. The heat pressed against him, sweat dripping down his face beneath his mask, his heartbeat so loud he could feel it in his throat. "Mark!" Ross barked, his voice cutting through the static of the fire. "Fall back." That's an order. But Mark didn't stop. The bear stilled. The air between them seemed to thicken, a strange, suffocating weight pressing against his chest as he took another step forward. He could feel the stares of his team boring into his back, could sense the tension radiating from them, their hands hovering near their equipment, ready to act at a moment's notice. But the bear didn't attack. It didn't lunge, didn't snarl, didn't rear up in defense. It stepped back, a single, slow movement, its dark eyes locked onto Mark's, deep and unreadable, watching him with an intensity that sent a shiver crawling up his spine. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was something else entirely. It was trust. The realization hit him so hard it nearly made him stop breathing. This wasn't a wild animal caught in panic. This wasn't an unpredictable beast ready to lash out. This was a mother, and she was waiting. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry as he took another step closer, his hands steady despite the fire raging around them. The bear exhaled, her massive frame shifting slightly, her muscles coiled, her ears flicking forward. The tree behind her groaned, its base splitting apart, the fire carving through its insides with ruthless efficiency. It wouldn't hold much longer. The firefighters behind him remained frozen, their bodies tense, their breathing shallow, their disbelief palpable. Mark wasn't sure if he was breathing at all. He moved slowly, deliberately, his movements controlled, careful not to startle her. The bear didn't move. She simply watched, her massive paws digging slightly into the dirt, as if she were waiting for something. The ground beneath the tree shifted, cracking loudly. There was no more time. Mark took the final step, and the bear led him. The fire did not relent. It consumed everything in its path, a roaring force of destruction that showed no mercy to the ancient trees, the underbrush, or the very ground beneath it. The towering pines cracked and splintered, their bark curling inward as flames swallowed them whole, their blackened remains collapsing with an eerie finality. Smoke billowed in thick, suffocating waves, curling into the night sky, blotting out the stars and turning the once pristine air into a toxic, choking mass of heat and embers. Every gust of wind sent sparks flying in all directions, feeding the inferno, spreading it further, deeper, faster. The world was fire, and there was no escape from its grasp. Mark felt the oppressive weight of the heat pressing in from all sides, his protective gear doing little to shield him from the sheer force of the blaze. His breaths came in short, shallow gasps, his lungs struggling against the thick, smoke-filled air that wrapped around him like an invisible hand, squeezing tighter with every second. Sweat dripped down the back of his neck, his skin burning beneath the layers of fabric and protective padding. But he couldn't think about that now. He couldn't think about the fire pressing closer, about the way the unstable ground beneath him trembled as another tree in the distance groaned and collapsed into the inferno. Because beneath the wreckage, beneath the smoldering remnants of a fallen tree, something moved. Mark dropped to one knee, his body tense, his muscles coiled as he peered through the swirling smoke and glowing embers. The fire's flickering light cast shifting shadows across the forest floor, illuminating every charred surface, every twisted, broken branch, every ember that danced in the air like fireflies in a storm. But his eyes were locked on a single point, a space just beneath the heavy, splintered trunk of the fallen tree, a narrow gap barely visible through the haze of destruction. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The way the heat distorted the air, the way the fire twisted and warped everything it touched, it wouldn't have been the first time exhaustion and adrenaline had made him see something that wasn't really there. But then, through the smoke, through the relentless heat waves rising from the scorched earth, he saw it. A small, fragile shape pressed low to the ground. A cub, his breath caught in his throat, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs with such force that he could hear it over the roar of the fire. It was barely moving, its tiny body trembling, its fur streaked with soot and ash, darkened by the smoke curling around it. The cub's small paws twitched against the burnt earth, its claws scraping weakly at the ground, but it was pinned, trapped beneath the crushing weight of the fallen tree, caught in a prison of charred branches and collapsing debris. It wasn't just stuck, it was helpless. A thin, pitiful whimper escaped the cub's throat, a sound so faint, so weak, that was almost lost beneath the inferno raging around them. Mark's stomach clenched at the sound, a deep, gut-wrenching pull that sent a cold shiver racing down his spine despite the unbearable heat pressing in from all sides. It was the sound of exhaustion, of fear, of something too small to fight back against the world that was swallowing it whole. The cub wasn't thrashing, wasn't struggling in panic. It didn't have the energy left to do so. It had been here for too long, breathing in the smoke, trapped beneath the debris, unable to move, unable to escape. And it was running out of time. Mark's gloved hands moved before his mind could fully catch up, reaching toward the wreckage, feeling for a way to shift the heavy branches that pinned the cub in place. His fingers curled around the splintered wood, the heat radiating from it so intense that even through the thick material of his gloves, he could feel the burn. He gritted his teeth, forcing his grip to tighten, his muscles flexing as he tried to lift, to shift, to move anything. The wood barely budged. The cub let out another soft, broken whimper, its small body twitching with the effort of trying to move, trying to respond, but it was too weak. Too far gone. Mark exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting as he repositioned his stance, planting his feet firmly against the unsteady ground, trying again. The fire was closing in, the smoke thickening, the oppressive heat growing stronger with every passing second. The flames curled around the edges of the fallen tree, devouring the bark, hollowing it out from within. The structure was weakening, threatening to collapse further, to seal the cub's fate in an instant. His radio crackled in his ear, a burst of static before a voice came through. Ross's voice, sharp, commanding, laced with urgency. "Mark, report. What's happening?" He barely heard it. The weight of the situation pressed down on him harder than the fire, harder than the exhaustion burning in his limbs. The cub's tiny sides heaved with each shallow breath, its body barely rising and falling, its strength fading. He could see the way its dark eyes flickered open and closed, sluggish, unfocused, struggling to stay awake. If he didn't act now, it wouldn't matter how much effort he put into freeing it, because it wouldn't be breathing long enough to make it out. Mark clenched his jaw, his entire body coiled with tension as he braced himself for another attempt. He wasn't going to let this fire take another life. He wasn't going to stand by and watch something so small, so fragile, disappear beneath the flames. His fingers curled tighter around the wood, his breath coming fast and shallow as he pulled with everything he had. The tree groaned in protest, the structure resisting, the fire eating away at its core, threatening to send the entire thing crumbling downward in an instant. He could hear the distant echoes of his team shouting through the radio, telling him to fall back, telling him to retreat, telling him that the fire was too close. But Mark didn't move, because the cub hadn't moved, and he wasn't leaving without it. The fire was unrelenting, its fury consuming everything in its path, filling the air with thick, acrid smoke that clawed at the lungs and turned the night into an endless battlefield of embers and destruction. The fallen tree groaned under its own weight, its charred structure threatening to collapse completely at any moment. The flames licking hungrily at its base, turning wood into fragile, crumbling ash. The heat was unbearable, radiating in waves, pressing down on the firefighters as they moved with desperate precision, their training fighting against the primal fear that fire instilled in every living thing. Mark's muscles burned as he struggled against the heavy, smoldering branches, his hands trembling with the effort, his breath coming in sharp, labored gasps. The cub lay beneath the wreckage, small and fragile, its fur darkened with soot, its tiny paws twitching weakly as it let out a faint, helpless whimper. It was trapped, pinned beneath the weight of the fallen tree, its strength fading with every passing second. Mark could feel the desperation clawing at his chest, the crushing realization that he wouldn't be able to lift the debris alone. The fire was moving too fast. The structure above them was too unstable. If they didn't act now, the cub wouldn't survive. "Mark, report." Ross's voice cut through the static of the radio, sharp and commanding, barely audible over the deafening roar of the fire. Mark swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the charred wood. "I found it," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It's trapped. I can't get out on my own." There was a brief silence. Then, "We're coming to you." The team moved fast, breaking from their defensive positions, weaving through the burning wreckage with years of trained precision. Martinez was the first to reach Mark, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the tiny cub lying motionless beneath the debris. He didn't waste time asking questions. Instead, he dropped down beside Mark, assessing the situation with quick, calculating eyes before gripping the heaviest part of the fallen trunk. Ross arrived seconds later, his face set in a grim mask of determination. "We move on my count," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Martinez, Mark, brace yourselves. We lift on 3. Mark positioned himself, every muscle in his body coiled with tension, ready to give everything he had left. The fire raged around them, the smoke thickening, the embers dancing like dying stars in the suffocating night. The cub let out another weak sound, barely more than a whisper, its tiny body trembling with exhaustion. Ross took a deep breath. 1. The fire cracked, sending a spray of burning debris into the air. 2. The ground beneath them trembled as another tree collapsed in the distance, the echo of its fall shaking through the burning landscape. 3. They moved as one, their combined strength forcing the massive, burning trunk upward, the weight resisting, fighting against them, threatening to pull them down with it. Their muscles screamed in protest, the searing heat pressing in, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Inch by inch, they lifted until finally, there was just enough space. Mark didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, reaching into the narrow opening, his gloved hands closing around the cub's small, trembling frame. It was warm, its tiny heart racing against his fingers, its breath rapid and uneven. He pulled it free, cradling it against his chest, shielding it from the falling embers and the relentless heat pressing in from all sides. The moment the cub was out, the remains of the tree gave one final, shuddering groan before collapsing entirely, sending a fresh wave of smoke and flames billowing into the air. The ground beneath them trembled, but they had done it. The cub was alive. Mark exhaled sharply, his entire body shaking from the effort, from the weight of everything that had just happened. His arms curled protectively around the small creature, its tiny form pressed against the fabric of his gear, its breath still rapid but steady. It was scared, but it was alive. Then, a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the clearing. The mother bear. She had been waiting. The massive creature stood just beyond the fire line, her dark eyes locked onto Mark, onto the cub in his arms. Her body was tense, her breath slow and deliberate, but she did not move forward. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. She simply watched. Ross placed a firm hand on Mark's shoulder, his voice low. "Slowly," he said. "No sudden movements." Mark nodded, his throat dry, his heart pounding as he took a cautious step forward. The bear remained still, her muscles shifting slightly, her ears flicking forward, but she did not retreat. The cub let out a soft, pitiful cry against Mark's chest. And that was all it took. The bear exhaled, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the air like distant thunder. Then, she took a step forward. The tension in the air was suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The fire still raged, the destruction still loomed around them. But for this one fragile second, none of it mattered. It was just Mark, the cub, and the mother bear standing in the space between survival and instinct. Mark lowered himself slightly, his hands steady, his breath slow as he extended the cub forward. The tiny creature let out a soft, weak noise as its mother stepped closer, her massive paws pressing into the scorched earth, her eyes never leaving Mark's. Then, with careful, deliberate movements, she reached out and nudged the cub with her nose. A soft, almost inaudible sound rumbled from her throat, something close to relief. Mark slowly released his hold. The cub stumbled slightly as it met the ground, its tiny legs unsteady, but the moment it felt the familiar presence of its mother, it pressed itself against her thick fur. She lowered her head, nudging it again, as if checking every inch of its small body, confirming that it was real, that it was alive. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the bear lifted her gaze. She looked at Mark, at Ross, at Martinez. Then, without another sound, she turned, guiding her cub toward the darkened tree line, away from the fire, away from the destruction, away from them. The firefighters stood in silence as she disappeared into the shadows, the faint rustling of leaves the only sign that she had ever been there at all. Only when she was gone did Mark finally exhale. And behind them, the fire still burned. The night was still burning. The fire, though beaten back, still raged in pockets throughout the forest, devouring everything in its path with an unrelenting hunger. Smoke curled into the dark sky, blotting out the stars, turning the world into an endless swirl of ash and embers. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. Every breath the firefighters took was laced with the acrid taste of destruction. Every movement slow and weighted by exhaustion. They had fought through the worst of it, but the battle wasn't over. Not yet. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, there was something else. Something small. Something fragile. The bear cub was free. Mark had barely loosened his grip when the tiny creature let out a trembling, pitiful sound, its soot-covered fur quivering as it pushed its unsteady legs against the ground. For a brief moment, it hesitated, unsure, its body still weak from being trapped for so long. Then, as if realizing it was no longer held, no longer pinned beneath the crushing weight of the fallen tree, it moved. A stumbling step forward. Another. Then, suddenly, as if an unseen force had pulled the fear from its body, the cub bolted. A blur of dark fur and tiny paws, kicking up ash as it raced forward, its instincts driving it toward the only thing that mattered. Its mother. The great bear stood waiting just beyond the fire line, her massive form illuminated by the flickering glow of the dying flames. She had been motionless, watching, her dark eyes locked onto the cub from the moment it had been pulled free. She hadn't moved, hadn't so much as shifted her weight, as if she knew that this moment would come, that she only had to wait, that her patience, her trust, would be rewarded. The cub's weak cries echoed through the burning air, small but desperate, the sound of pure longing, of relief, of recognition. The mother bear let out a low, rumbling sound in return. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a warning. It was something deeper, something older, something primal. It was the sound of reassurance, of comfort, of something ancient that no fire, no destruction, no force of nature could ever erase. Then she moved. With a slow, deliberate motion, she lowered her massive head, meeting her cub's frantic little body as it collided against her front legs. The tiny creature pressed itself against her, burying its face into the thick fur of her chest, its small body still trembling, still weak, but no longer alone. The mother bear nudged the cub gently, her nose pressing against its back, its face, as if to make sure, truly make sure, that it was real, that it was safe, that it was hers. She exhaled, a long, deep breath, the sound vibrating through the air, a noise so heavy with relief that it seemed to settle over everything, sinking into the very ground beneath them. And then, without a single glance back, she turned. The cub followed. The two of them disappeared into the forest, their dark forms slipping between the charred trees, vanishing into the shadows beyond the reach of the fire. Silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the distant crackling of flames still fighting to survive, the low hum of water hoses still dousing the smoldering earth. The firefighters stood frozen, their bodies stiff, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Because it didn't make sense. Because it shouldn't have happened. Because the bear, this massive, wild, unpredictable force of nature, had trusted them. Ross was the first to break the silence, exhaling slowly as he ran a soot-streaked hand over his damp forehead, his eyes still locked on the space where the mother bear had been only moments before. "Did that just happen?" he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion. Martinez let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. I think it did." The rest of the team was still silent, their faces unreadable behind the layers of grime and sweat that coated their skin. But there was something else in their eyes, something unspoken, awe, respect, something they wouldn't be able to explain to anyone who hadn't been here to see it for themselves. Mark swallowed, his throat dry as he finally forced himself to move, his arms still tingling from the weight of the cub, his muscles aching from the sheer effort of the last few minutes. He glanced down at his gloves, the soot and ash smudging the material, the faint traces of tiny paw prints still visible against the fabric. He let out a shaky breath. "You ever see anything like that before?" someone asked behind him, their voice quiet, almost reverent. Ross shook his head. "Not in 20 years. Martinez gave a tired laugh. "Not a lifetime." Mark just stared at the forest, at the darkness where the bears had disappeared, at the space where something unexplainable had just happened, something that shouldn't have been possible, and yet was. Because logic said that the bear should have run the moment she saw humans. Logic said she should have fought them, should have defended her cub with everything she had, should have treated them as threats, as enemies, as something to fear. But she hadn't. She had trusted them. And trust like that didn't come from nowhere. Trust like that was earned. The fire still burned. The work wasn't done. But for a moment, just a moment, the heat didn't seem so unbearable, the exhaustion didn't feel so crushing, and the night didn't seem quite as dark.